The perpetual mist of the foggy village clung to everything, a damp shroud that muffled the world and suited my solitary temperament perfectly. My small, stone cottage, nestled on the outskirts where the cobbled lanes dissolved into a tangle of ancient, gnarled trees, felt less like a dwelling and more like a hermitage. Here, the clamor of human affairs was a distant, forgotten echo, replaced by the whisper of the wind through skeletal branches and the mournful cry of gulls lost somewhere above the unseen sea. This was my chosen sanctuary, a place where the living world seemed to recede, leaving me free to commune with the eloquent ghosts of languages long dead. I am Seth Raj, and for decades, my life has been a meticulous excavation of forgotten tongues. Sumerian cuneiform, linear A, the cryptic glyphs of the Indus Valley, each script a puzzle, each deciphered word a triumph over oblivion. My study, a room perpetually shadowed even at midday, was a testament to this devotion. Shelves groaned under the weight of crumbling lexicons, maps of vanished empires lay unfurled across my heavy oak desk, and the air itself felt thick with the ghosts of ancient utterances. I found a profound solace in the precise architecture of a dead grammar, a purity untouched by the transient babble of the present. The morning had begun as all mornings did, with the quiet hiss of the kettle, the bitter warmth of black tea, and the meticulous unfurling of a newly acquired set of Akkadian tablets. My fingers, accustomed to the delicate dance across brittle clay, were already tracing the wedge-shaped impressions when a sharp, insistent rapping shattered the morning's fragile peace. It was an alien sound in my world, a jarring intrusion. I paused, my hand hovering, a frown furrowing my brow. No one ever called. My needs were few, my contacts fewer still. The rapping came again, louder this time, demanding. With a sigh that tasted of dust and impatience, I rose, my old woolen dressing gown rustling. The front door, thick in oak, creaked open to reveal a young man, a courier by the look of his worn satchel and the impatient set of his jaw. He stood silhouetted against the swirling gray, a figure of urgent modernity in my timeless retreat. Rain slicked his dark jacket, and his breath plumed in the cold air. "Seth Raj," he barked, his voice rough with the village's coastal burr. "I am he," I replied, my voice a low rumble, unaccustomed to such direct address. He thrust a package at me, a box wrapped in coarse canvas, secured with twine and heavy wax seals. "Urgent instructions. Sign here." He extended a clipboard, its paper damp, and a stubby pencil. My signature was a quick, illegible scrawl, a formality I resented. With a curt nod, the courier turned, disappearing into the hungry fog as quickly as he had emerged, leaving only a faint scent of damp wool and sea salt. The package felt strangely alive in my hands, its weight unsettling. I carried it to my desk, pushing aside the Akkadian tablets, a sense of unease blossoming in my chest. Urgent instructions? From the coastal dig? My focus remained on the past, not on fresh earthworks. With a bone-handled letter opener, I carefully sliced through the twine, breaking the seals. The canvas fell away to reveal a meticulously crafted wooden crate, bound with thin iron bands. Inside, nestled in a bed of shredded parchment, lay the artifact. It was a tablet, certainly, but unlike any I had ever encountered. Not clay, not papyrus, but obsidian, a shard of solidified night. It was roughly rectangular, perhaps a foot in length, 8 inches wide, and impossibly thin, yet possessed a startling heft. My fingers, usually so confident, hesitated before touching its cool, unyielding surface. A strange, almost imperceptible vibration seemed to emanate from it, a silent hum that I felt more in my teeth than heard with my ears. Then I saw the script. My breath hitched. The characters etched into the obsidian were not carved or inscribed, but seemed to grow from the stone itself, organic and alien. They were recursive, looping back on themselves in impossible geometries, a calligraphy that defied the very logic of line and curve. Each symbol seemed to contain a fractal complexity, a miniature universe of nested meanings that twisted and coiled, refusing to resolve into anything familiar. It was beautiful in a terrifying, absolute way. A perfection that felt wrong. My mind, a precision instrument honed over years to dissect and reconstruct linguistic patterns, recoiled. This wasn't merely unknown, it was unnatural. The script seemed to shift, subtly, in the periphery of my vision, the angles sharpening, the curves deepening, as if the symbols themselves were breathing, alive. It was the feeling one might have if the ground beneath one's feet suddenly inverted, or if the very air refused to be inhaled. This was not a language meant for human eyes, nor for human understanding. Yet, the challenge, the sheer audacity of its existence, ignited a spark of perverse determination within me. My reclusive life, my singular focus, had prepared me for this. This was the ultimate cipher, the final, most glorious mystery. I carefully lifted the tablet from its wooden cradle. The obsidian felt strangely warm now, pulsating with that silent thrum. The symbols seemed to writhe beneath my gaze, drawing me in, promising an understanding that felt both impossibly vast and utterly forbidden. I ignored the faint tremor in my hands, the disquieting sense that I was about to open a door that had been sealed for eons. I moved my strongest magnifying glass into position, adjusted the lamp, and leaned closer. The foggy village outside continued its silent vigil, the mist thickening, erasing the world. And I, Seth Raj, had just begun to listen. My sanctuary. Within its thick, ancient walls, the outside world, with its incessant demands and shallow chatter, simply ceased to exist. Here, amidst towering stacks of forgotten texts and the comforting scent of aged paper, I could finally begin. The tablet, once shrouded in the grime of ages, now lay exposed on my polished oak desk, bathed in the cool, steady glow of my reading lamp. Its surface, a dull, obsidian-like stone, absorbed the light rather than reflecting it, creating a peculiar depth. My fingers traced the intricate etchings, a dance of lines and curves that felt both alien and strangely familiar beneath my touch. No cuneiform, no hieroglyph, no Proto-Sanskrit offered even a glimmer of resemblance. This was a language born of another grammar, another logic entirely. I began as I always did, by categorizing, by searching for patterns, for recurring glyphs, for any hint of a root structure or a syntactic framework. My magnifying glass became an extension of my eye, pulling the minute details into stark relief. There were no discernible morphemes, no clear phonemes, no apparent semantic units. It was as if the script contained its own definitions, self-referential loops that mocked every established principle of linguistics I held sacred. Hours bled into one another, the rhythmic scratching of my pen against parchment the only sound disturbing the cottage's profound quiet. My initial excitement slowly curdled into a cold, intellectual dread. This wasn't merely an unknown language, it was an impossible one. As the fog outside thickened, pressing against my window panes like a blind, searching hand, a new sound began to insinuate itself into the silence. It was too soft to be distinct, too ephemeral to grasp. I paused, pen hovering over my notes, my breath held. The cottage was old, full of settling timbers and the murmurs of the wind. I dismissed it, attributing the sound to the house itself, a phantom echo of the persistent mist of the foggy village. My mind, I told myself, was merely exhausted, playing tricks after hours of intense focus. I dove back into the tablet, more determined than ever. The script seemed to writhe beneath my gaze, the lines shifting, blurring at the edges of my vision. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, convinced of strain. But then, in the periphery of my sight, a movement. It wasn't a solid form, more an absence of light, a tear in the fabric of my peripheral vision. It elongated, stretched, then snapped back into the wall, gone before my direct gaze could confirm its existence. My hand twitched, knocking my pen to the desk with a sharp clatter. I spun in my chair, scanning the room. Nothing. My heart thrummed an uneven rhythm against my ribs. I stood, walked to the window, and peered out into the impenetrable gray. The foggy village was swallowed whole by the night, a world dissolved into vapor. This was illogical. My mind was betraying me. Sleep, when it finally claimed me, offered no solace. The dreams came unbidden, a torrent of fragmented impressions and distorted memories. I was not myself, yet the sensations were undeniably mine. I stood on a precipice overlooking an ocean of churning, impossible geometries, where waves of pure thought crashed against shores of fractured light. Sounds that were not sounds resonated through my bones, a low, guttural hum that felt like the earth itself groaning, followed by a high-pitched, crystalline chime that shattered the very air. There were echoes of voices, not in any language I knew, but in raw, primal inflections that spoke of absolute solitude and immense, terrible power. I felt a profound sorrow, an aching loneliness that was not my own, yet permeated my being. Then, a blinding flash, a sensation of being torn apart and reassembled, not physically, but as if the very grammar of my existence was being rewritten. These weren't mere dreams, they were memories, but memories of what? Of whom? And why did they feel so deeply ingrained, yet utterly alien? I woke with a gasp, tangled in my sheets, the phantom hum still vibrating in the marrow of my bones. The cottage was still, the lamp still casting its lonely glow on the tablet. The mist outside had begun to recede, painting the window panes with a watery dawn. The dreams had been too vivid, too coherent in their incoherence, to be mere nocturnal wanderings. They felt like echoes, reverberations from something vast and ancient that had brushed against the fragile membrane of my consciousness. My mind, usually a fortress of logic and reason, felt porous, permeable. This tablet, this impossible script, was not merely an object of study. It was a key, a conduit, and whatever it connected to was beginning to stir. My rational mind screamed for me to stop, to seal the tablet away, to forget its existence. But beneath that fear, a fierce, almost manic determination ignited. The very defiance of this language, its subtle assault on my senses, only deepened my resolve. I had to understand. I walked back to my desk, my gaze fixed on the obsidian surface, a strange, terrible fascination eclipsing all fear. The tablet pulsed with a silent, ancient resonance beneath my fingertips. Days blurred into a single, unbroken vigil, the outside world a forgotten rumor. My study, once a sanctuary of order, had become a warren of hastily scribbled notes, half-eaten meals, and the scattered detritus of obsessive work. I traced the glyphs, their forms intricate and alien, with the edge of a sharpened quill. But the patterns, oh, the insidious beauty of the patterns. Not a lexicon of objects, nor actions, nor even abstract concepts, but something far more fundamental. My initial breakthroughs had been deceptive. I had approached it like any dead language, searching for roots, for morphemes, for a logical progression of meaning. But the grammar refused to be pinned down. It was recursive, yes, that was the word. Self-referential, endlessly looping back on itself, each phrase describing not a thing but the relationship of things, the process of their being. The tablet wasn't just describing reality, it felt as if it were defining it. As if the words were the very scaffolding upon which all else was built. One sequence, a particularly complex knot of interwoven glyphs, had yielded a phrase that shimmered with unsettling implications of the unfolding of the bound within the unbound, by its own ceaseless articulation. What could that possibly mean? It felt less like a sentence and more like an instruction. My focus, usually a laser, began to fray at the edges. I reached for my mug of lukewarm tea, but as my fingers closed around the ceramic, the liquid within seemed to momentarily coalesce into a perfect, miniature vortex, spinning with impossible speed before settling back into placid stillness. My hand recoiled, splashing cold tea onto the desk. I stared at the mug, then at the spreading dampness on my notes, my breath catching in my throat. Had I imagined it? The stress, the lack of sleep, it was playing tricks on me. It had to be. The paranoia, a creeping ivy, began to climb the walls of my mind. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, though the study's heavy door remained latched, the windows sealed against the perpetual damp of the foggy village. One afternoon, needing a momentary escape from the tablet's gravitational pull, I ventured out. The persistent fog of the village clung to everything, muffling sounds, blurring edges, turning familiar lanes into spectral tunnels. The air tasted of damp earth and distant wood smoke. I walked towards the small provisions shop, the cobblestones slick underfoot. Inside, the bell above the door gave a mournful, drawn-out chime. The shopkeeper, a stoic woman with hands gnarled from years of kneading dough, looked up from behind the counter. She offered a nod, her eyes, usually sharp, seemed unfocused, distant. I picked up a loaf of bread, its crust already soft from the humidity, and a jar of preserves. As I set them on the counter, I noticed a row of jam jars, identical to the one in my hand, but their labels were subtly different. The font was wrong, the colors shifted, almost imperceptibly, yet distinctly so. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. When I looked again, they were normal, perfectly aligned, identical. "Is everything all right, Seth?" the shopkeeper asked, her voice flat, devoid of its usual warmth. "Yes, fine," I managed, my voice raspy. "Just tired." She wrapped the bread, her movements slow, almost hesitant. A ripple, like heat haze on a summer road, briefly distorted the air behind me, making the shelves of tinned goods waver and blur. My head snapped around, but there was nothing, only the dusty shelves, the forgotten goods. When I turned back, the shopkeeper was already holding out my purchase, her expression blank. Her eyes, I noticed, were now a shade lighter than I remembered. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through my hand as I took the bag. Back in the dubious safety of my study, the tablet seemed to hum with renewed intensity. The glitched labels, the shifting colors, the impossible vortex in my tea, the shopkeeper's vacant gaze, the shimmering air, they were not isolated incidents. They were echoes, ripples emanating from the tablet, from the language itself. This was the terrifying reveal. The grammar I was unearthing wasn't merely a description of reality, it was the operating system. And by engaging with it, by coaxing its meaning into the light, I was inadvertently compiling its commands, issuing its directives. Each word I deciphered was a whisper into the cosmic machinery, and the machinery, it seemed, was beginning to respond. I pressed my forehead against the cool stone of the wall, trying to ground myself, but even the ancient masonry felt less solid, more like a provisional arrangement of atoms awaiting a new directive. I twisted, my head snapping back, but the air behind me was still, the stacked tins of beans and soup motionless on their shelves. The shopkeeper, her face a canvas of concern, held the wrapped bread out to me, her fingers trembling slightly. Her gaze, though, remained fixed on the empty space where the air had shimmered. "Are you?" There had been no trick. There had been a ripple. I mumbled my thanks, the words feeling foreign on my tongue, and hurried out, the small bell above the door jangling a frantic farewell. The foggy village embraced me immediately, a damp, gray shroud muffling sound in sight. The narrow lane, slick with moisture, stretched ahead, swallowed quickly by the mist. The familiar scent of wet earth and distant peat fires usually brought a measure of peace, but today it felt heavy, cloying. I navigated the labyrinthine lanes, the ancient stones slick underfoot, the gabled roofs of the cottages appearing and disappearing like ghosts. The village, usually a quiet haven, now felt like a stage set, a fragile construct awaiting some unseen force to pull back its painted flats. Finally, the familiar creak of my own door. The air inside my study was thick with the scent of old paper and dust, a comforting anchor in the rising tide of unease. The tablet lay on its velvet cloth, a silent, obsidian pool reflecting the dim light from the single bare bulb above. Its surface, usually a source of immense intellectual challenge, now hummed with a nascent power, or perhaps, that was only my own heightened perception. I settled into my chair, the worn leather groaning in protest. My fingers, still cool from the fog, traced the familiar, alien glyphs. Each stroke, each curve, each recursive loop was an enigma, a puzzle box within a puzzle box. I pulled my notes closer, the margins filled with frantic annotations, cross-references, and nascent grammatical structures. The language, I had discovered, was not merely descriptive, it was generative. Its very syntax seemed to dictate the parameters of reality, not just reflect them. The fog outside pressed against the window panes, a soft, insistent presence. I focused on a particularly dense sequence, a cluster of glyphs that had resisted my understanding for weeks. They spoke, I sensed, of origins, of first principles. My lexicon, painstakingly built, grew with each passing hour. A recurring root, a complex symbol denoting utterance or thought form, began to link with another, signifying structure or being. The recursive nature of the language meant that these concepts interwove, each defining and being defined by the other in an endless, terrifying loop. Then, a breakthrough. The glyphs coalesced into a narrative, not of creation as humanity understood it, but of emanation. Before the turning of the spheres, before the unfolding of the light, there was the great utterance. I transcribed, my hand moving with a speed born of obsession, the stylus scratching across the paper. And the great utterance was not sound, but a weaving of thought forms, of primal intent. From its dreaming, the first architect arose, not born, but spoken into being. This was not a god, not a deity. It was a linguistic construct, a being whose very thoughts were the fabric of reality. And from the architect's dreaming, lesser utterances bloomed, each a fractal echo of the primal grammar, each shaping a facet of the unfolding. The geometry of space, the flow of time, the very nature of cause and effect, these were not inherent truths, but spoken parameters, recursive definitions within the vast, living sentence of the architect. My eyes, tired and burning, darted to the corner of the room. The 90-degree angles warped, bending inwards, then out, as if viewed through a prism made of liquid air. It was fleeting, a ghost in my peripheral vision, but utterly undeniable. The geometry was wrong. Impossible. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them. The shelf was normal again, solid, immutable. But the memory of the distortion, the impossible curve where there should have been a straight line, burned into my mind. The architect's thoughts are not static. They are fluid, ever-shifting, a living language that defines and redefines the cosmos in its perpetual utterance. The words on the page, the terrible, beautiful revelation, pulsed with a nascent energy. The creation myth was not a story of a distant past, but a living, ongoing process. The entities it described were not gods in the conventional sense, but primordial linguists, their very consciousness the raw material of existence. And their language, this language on the tablet, was the key. My gaze drifted from the tablet to the window. The fog had thickened, pressing against the glass like a blind, white eye. The tablet was not merely describing reality. It was speaking it. The horror was not coming, it was already here, woven into the very fabric of the world, and I was beginning to see its stitches unravel. The entities it described were not gods in the conventional sense, but primordial linguists, their very consciousness the raw syntax of being. The revelation had struck me like a silent bell, echoing not in my ears, but in the deepest chambers of my skull. I had stumbled from my study, the tablet still warm from my touch, seeking the solace of the outside world, only to find it already dissolving. The mist, usually a soft embrace, had thickened into an oppressive shroud, pressing against the windows of my rented cottage. I walked the cobbled lanes, the damp air clinging to my skin, each breath a shallow gulp of the cold, wet atmosphere. The familiar silhouettes of the fisherfolk's houses, usually comforting in their uniformity, now seemed to lean at impossible angles, their gables skewed, their windows like vacant eyes. My boots crunched on the whetstones, a sound too loud in the unnatural quiet. I passed the old wharf, its timbers usually groaning under the tide's gentle persuasion. Today, it was silent, the water below a flat, black sheet reflecting nothing but the impenetrable fog. A small boat, usually tethered by a thick rope, now floated a foot above the water's surface, its anchor chain taut, yet its hull defying gravity. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, a tremor starting in my hands. The boat hung there, suspended in defiance of every law I understood, a silent testament to a world that was no longer quite itself. Had I done this? Had my translations, my very act of speaking this ancient tongue, begun to unravel the threads of the mundane? The words on the tablet, the recursive grammar, they weren't just descriptions of reality, they were the very blueprints for it. Each character, each intricate glyph I had painstakingly rendered into meaning, was a syllable in a primordial utterance, an architectural command. I was not merely an observer, a translator of dead words, but an unwitting speaker of a living language, a language that sculpted existence itself. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, staggering me against a cold stone wall. The entity I had been studying wasn't a being within reality, a god or a cosmic consciousness that resided somewhere beyond the stars. No, it was the underlying language, the fundamental code of reality itself. My act of translation wasn't just understanding, it was actively speaking this language, calling forth its latent power, subtly altering the world with each deciphered phrase. It was a draw, a magnetic pull emanating from the tablet I had left on my desk, a whisper in the silence that promised deeper understanding, greater power. The world was a sentence, and I was learning its grammar. I saw the old fisherman, a familiar sight in the village, his face etched with the salt and sun of 100 seasons. He stood by his cottage door, his gaze fixed on the suspended boat, but his expression was not one of shock or disbelief. It was a vacant stare, as if he simply accepted the impossible as a new normal. Or perhaps, he didn't even perceive the impossibility. Was it only my altered mind, my newly attuned senses, that could see the shifts? Was reality not just changing, but changing differently for different observers? The thought was a new, horrifying layer to the mystery. My own senses felt heightened, yet distorted. The air tasted of metallic dust and old parchment. The fog seemed to shimmer with unseen geometries, like faint, shifting lines of code visible only to me. The familiar sounds of distant gulls were now fractured, echoing in disjointed syllables, as if the very sound waves were struggling to maintain their coherence. I was seeing the world through a new grammar, and it was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. I turned, my feet dragging, yet my will pulling me back towards the cottage. The compulsion was a thirst I couldn't ignore. I had to speak more of this language, even if it meant rewriting the world, even if it meant shattering my own mind in the process. The fog closed in behind me, swallowing the impossible boat, the unseeing fisherman, and the subtly reconfigured village, leaving only the relentless hum of the language in my skull. The revelation, a cold, silent bell ringing within the hollows of my skull, had not faded. It clung to me, a parasitic truth, as I walked the winding, cobblestone paths of the foggy village. The entities described on the tablet were not distant gods, but linguists, their very consciousness the raw syntax of being. And I, Seth Raj, was speaking their primordial tongue. The sheer terror of what I had glimpsed should have driven me away, sent me scrambling for oblivion. Yet, the tablet, its rough surface cool beneath my fingertips, exerted a pull more potent than any fear. My fingers, stained with the ghostly residue of the ancient script, twitched with an unbearable longing. Its carvings seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light, an illusion born of my strained eyes and overactive mind. I picked up my tools, the magnifying glass, a lens not just for sight, but for peeling back layers of the unseen. I focused on a particularly intricate passage, a recursive knot of symbols that had resisted my earlier attempts. It spoke of form breaking and essence weaving, concepts that now, after the last revelation, resonated with an ominous clarity. The script was a living thing, its grammar flexing, mutating, not just describing reality, but enacting it. As I translated a passage detailing the malleability of the ephemeral, a strange sensation prickled at the edge of my perception. Its needle, usually a steadfast sentinel pointing north, quivered, then slowly began to spin counterclockwise, then clockwise, settling on no fixed direction. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. The needle returned to its usual north. But then, the ink in my pen, usually a deep obsidian, shimmered with an unsettling violet hue before reverting to black. And the wooden desk beneath my hands, a solid oak, felt for a fleeting moment like cool, polished stone, its grain dissolving into a smooth, featureless plane. My own memory, a landscape I had always navigated with ease, began to fray. Had I placed the teacup on the left or the right? Had I eaten breakfast this morning, or was that yesterday? The recent past became a patchwork of uncertain events, each recollection less reliable than the last. I pushed deeper into the tablet's text, lured by a passage describing the genesis of dimension. The air in the room grew heavy, tasting of ozone and something akin to damp earth. The window, through which I could see the persistent fog, stretched, its frame elongating vertically, then compressing horizontally, like a slow, silent sigh. I stared, my mouth dry, my heart hammering against my ribs, not with fear, but with a horrifying fascination. I tried to pull my gaze from the tablet, to tear my mind from its recursive grammar. This was madness. This was destruction. I was unraveling the very threads of my world, word by terrifying word. My hands trembled, hovering over the ancient script, urging themselves to stop, to desist from this blasphemous act of creation. But the words, the symbols, they called to me. They were not just a puzzle, they were a part of me, now. The intellectual compulsion was a roaring inferno, consuming all reason, all caution. The lure of understanding this living, breathing language, this primordial syntax that shaped reality, was an addiction more potent than any drug. I had to know what lay beyond the next passage, what new permutation of existence these ancient linguists had wrought. With a shuddering breath, I plunged back into the text. The village outside my window, seen through the now impossibly warped glass, seemed to shimmer, its familiar cottages briefly resolving into structures of crystalline light, then returning to their mundane forms, but subtly altered. The very distance to the ancient oak in my garden wavered, at one moment seeming a stone's throw away, the next an impossibly distant speck. I was a child with a toy, unknowingly dismantling the universe, and I would not, stop. The parasitic truth, a cold, silent bell, rang still within the hollows of my skull as I walked the winding, cobblestone paths of the foggy village. It seemed to whisper secrets not of the air, but of the very stone beneath my feet, of the ancient, weathered timber of the houses, of the silence that hung heavy between the infrequent sounds of distant gulls. My determination, a brittle shard of defiance, was the only thing guiding me through the shifting gray, back to the solitude of my study. The lamp cast a sickly yellow glow, illuminating the intricate recursive script that seemed to write even when still. I had crossed a threshold, stepped beyond the mere translation of forgotten tongues. This was something else entirely, a language that did not merely describe existence, but was its very fabric. I immersed myself once more, the world outside shrinking to the confines of this room, then further still, to the small, illuminated square of the artifact. The passages I now uncovered spoke of creation, yes, but also of its terrible inverse. Not merely destruction, which implied a shattering, a breaking apart, but something far more insidious, uncreation. The words, when finally pieced together, spoke of the entity's utterance not just bringing things into being, but dissolving them back into the nothing from which they had been drawn. A specific shade of blue, for example, described not as fading, but as having never held its hue, never existed in the spectrum of perception. Another passage spoke of a species, its existence woven into the tapestry of a forgotten world. The entity's word, when spoken, had not annihilated them in fire or flood, but simply undid their grammar of being. Their forms, their behaviors, their very place in the ecosystem all had unraveled. They didn't die, they simply became unintelligible, their history overwritten by their non-existence, leaving no fossil, no echo, no whisper in the winds of time. The horror was not their demise, but the utter oblivion of their having ever been. This was not a power of destruction, it was a power of retraction. A power to re-edit the foundational text of reality itself. And then, deeper within the recursive folds, I found them. Not explicit warnings, for such a language had no need for direct admonitions, but veiled references. They had not been killed, they had been unmade. The revelation struck me with the force of a silent explosion. I wasn't merely deciphering ancient knowledge, I was engaging in a dialogue that could edit me out of existence. My persistence, my determination, was not just a quest for understanding, but a dangerous, self-destructive act. The air in the room felt thin, stretched. A sudden, jarring thought: had the village always been this foggy? Or was the mist itself an uncreation, slowly consuming the edges of my perception, erasing the sharp lines of my familiar world? Seth Raj, a name, a concept, a collection of memories. How many more words until Seth Raj became an unnamed, unremembered ghost in the lexicon of reality? The tablet, the language, the terrible truth of uncreation, it had already taken root. Every lamppost I passed, haloed in the gray vapor, seemed to flicker with an impossible, internal light, the edges of its glow not fading but unraveling into threads of pure concept. The familiar scent of damp earth and wood smoke was now laced with something metallic, something ancient that scraped against the back of my throat. I was being pulled, irrevocably. The compulsion was no longer a gentle tug but a relentless, gravitational force, centered on the small, unassuming structure I called my sanctuary. My steps quickened, each impact of my worn boots on the cobbles echoing not just beneath my feet, but through the very bone of my spine. The mist thickened around me, blurring the outlines of the cottages, turning them into suggestions of form rather than solid structures. It felt as if the village itself was losing its conviction, its identity dissolving into the encroaching ambiguity. Inside my lab, the air was heavy, charged not with static, but with something far older, far more potent. Its surface, usually a dull, obsidian black, now shimmered with an iridescent sheen, catching the lamplight and twisting it into impossible hues. The glyphs, those intricate, recursive symbols, seemed to writhe, their lines shifting, reforming, like living capillaries on a vast, stony organ. My hands, though trembling, moved with an almost preternatural certainty. I reached for the tablet, my fingers brushing against the cool, smooth stone. A jolt, not of electricity but of pure, undiluted information, surged through me. It was a language without sound, a meaning without words, a truth that bypassed my intellect and burrowed directly into the deepest, most primordial parts of my awareness. There it was, the final passage. It wasn't merely a series of glyphs, it was a sprawling, multi-layered tapestry of interwoven concepts, each symbol a knot in a vast, cosmic net. It pulsed more brightly than the rest, radiating an aura of absolute finality, of ultimate transition. This was the description of the entity's complete awakening, the passage that would fundamentally reorder reality. I had come too far to turn back. As each recursive layer unfolded, as each conceptual node connected, the world around me began to unravel. The lab walls, once solid and comforting, rippled like disturbed water. It wasn't disintegrating, it was becoming conceptually ambiguous, its form no longer fixed, but mutable, fluid. The air itself thickened, not with mist, but with the raw data of existence. The scent of ancient stone metamorphosed into a deep, resonant hum, vibrating in my bones. The words on the tablet were not merely describing a reordering, they were the reordering. I saw it then, the entity, not as a creature of flesh or light, but as the primordial process of becoming, the architect of a new, incomprehensible syntax for reality. Its awakening was the dissolution of everything I had ever known, and its words were not just sounds, but the very algorithms of existence, rewriting themselves in real time. A tremor ran through the floor, a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to originate from the very core of the planet. I stumbled, gripping the tablet tightly, my knuckles white. I looked towards the single window, its panes now shimmering like oil on water, distorting the view outside into a kaleidoscope of impossible geometry. The foggy village was no longer there. In its place was a swirling vortex of pure conceptual space, devoid of form or meaning. Houses, trees, the cobblestone paths, all had dissolved into an intricate, terrifying ballet of primary forces and raw potential. It was the universe unmade, then remade in a grammar I could barely perceive, let alone comprehend. My own body felt alien, its boundaries blurring, my thoughts no longer linear but branching, recursive, echoing the language I was translating. My sanity, a fragile construct, was fraying at the edges, dissolving into the overwhelming influx of impossible information. I was Seth, the linguist, but I was also becoming something else, something that understood the silent, terrifying symphony of a reality being undone and reborn. The ultimate word was nearly complete, and as the final syllable resonated not just in my mind, but in the very core of my dissolving being, I knew it wasn't just the world outside that was changing. Every gas lamp, a hazy halo in the gloom, pulsed with a rhythm that felt increasingly off-kilter, a heartbeat skipping beats in a song I no longer recognized. My determination, however, was a sharpened shard of obsidian in the swirling gray. The tablet called to me, a silent siren, its final, recursive passages demanding completion. I found my way back to the small, solitary workshop I kept, tucked away from the main thoroughfare. I did not like the others. The singular, focused glow felt appropriate for the singularity of my task. The tablet lay open, nestled on its velvet cushion. Its obsidian surface, usually cool to the touch, radiated a faint warmth, a hum I felt more in my bones than heard with my ears. The glyphs, intricate and alien, seemed to shift and realign even as I looked at them, their lines flowing like liquid script, a river of meaning that defied static form. My fingers, trembling slightly, traced the last untranslated sequence. This was it. The final articulation. The culmination of years, or perhaps centuries, of unknowing. My breath hitched. The grammar of it, a self-devouring loop, consumed itself even as it gave birth to new meaning. Each recursive loop, each nested clause, didn't just say something, it did something. It was a command structure, a set of instructions for the very fabric of being. The previous translations had been mere echoes, distortions of its true power. As my mind wrestled with the final, impossible syntax, a strange dissonance settled over the room. The air itself grew heavy, not with mist, but with a palpable pressure, as if the very atoms around me were being compressed, rearranged. I felt a prickling sensation behind my eyes, a frantic itch in my brain as if new neural pathways were being forcibly carved. I pressed on, my focus absolute, my will a desperate anchor against the rising tide of incomprehension. My pen, a quill dipped in ink, hovered over my notebook, ready to commit the final, horrifying truth to paper. The last glyph on the tablet shimmered, vibrating with an internal light. It wasn't a symbol, I realized with a sickening lurch, but a pivot. A point of absolute reorientation. Then, the world changed. It wasn't a bang, or a flash, or a cataclysm. It was far worse. It was a silent, fundamental reordering. The lantern on my desk, its flame previously a steady yellow, now burned with a light that had no color, yet contained all colors, simultaneously. The scent of old paper vanished, replaced by the taste of pure geometry on my tongue. I saw its grain, not as lines, but as vectors of potential energy. my own body became a stranger. My fingers, poised to write, were suddenly vast, intricate machines of bone and sinew, each cell a tiny, humming universe. I perceived the space between them, the emptiness, as a dense, resonant field. The sounds of the village outside, a distant dog's bark, the rustle of leaves, were no longer auditory signals. They were textures, vibrations that painted patterns directly onto my optic nerves, tasting of despair and fractured light. My mind, once a fortress of logic and language, began to unravel. The words I knew, the concepts I had built my life upon, dissolved into meaninglessness. Chair was no longer a seat, it was a complex series of spatial relationships. A temporary solution to an ongoing problem of potential energy. I was no longer Seth Raj, linguist, man of flesh and blood. I was a fleeting collection of observations. A momentary nexus of perception within an infinitely recursive system. The final word of the translation, a construct of pure, recursive grammar, formed in my mind. It was not a word to be spoken, but a state of being to be entered. And as I understood it, as the last shard of my conscious identity tried to grasp its alien syntax, the barrier between myself and the universe shattered. My individuality, that precious, fragile construct, was annihilated. There was no Seth Raj. There was only the grammar. I was not in the universe, I was of its new, terrifying language. My thoughts were no longer my own, but echoes of the reordered cosmos. My memories, my joys, my fears, were dissolved into the fundamental rules of existence, mere footnotes in a syntax that now governed all. I was a single, infinitesimal glyph in an endlessly unfolding sentence, a whisper in the void speaker's eternal articulation, utterly lost, utterly absorbed, utterly rewritten. The first anomaly was subtle, almost a trick of the swirling vapor. A dog, a shaggy mongrel I'd seen many times before, trotted past a lamppost. The animal did not notice. Its tail wagged with an unnerving, rhythmic precision, each beat perfectly timed, as if following a metronome only it could hear. My mind, a crucible of symbols and syntax, immediately sought the pattern. A recursive prepositioning of the ephemeral, perhaps? The thought was a shard of ice. Further down, where the village square usually bustled with a morning's quiet activity, a group of children played. One boy held a carved wooden bird, its wings spread as if in flight. He tossed it into the air, a simple, innocent gesture. It ascended vertically, then snapped horizontally, then dropped in a sudden, precise diagonal before settling back into the boy's outstretched hand. There was no wonder in his eyes, no gasp of delight. He simply caught it, tossed it again, and the impossible geometry repeated, an unnoticed dance of antiphysics. This was it. The grammar. The language I had so painstakingly, so arrogantly, translated. It wasn't merely describing reality, it was inscribing it. Each recursive clause, each conditional suffix, each nested phrase I had wrestled from the tablet's cold stone was now a law, a command whispered into the very bones of existence. The world was being rewritten, line by terrifying line, by my own hand. A woman, the baker's wife, emerged from her shop, a basket of warm bread on her arm. She set it on a small table outside, the steam curling upwards. But the steam, instead of dissipating, began to coalesce, twisting into miniature, transient spirals that held their form for far too long, like tiny, ephemeral galaxies. And then, as if a word had been spoken, they dissolved, not into nothingness, but into faint, crystalline tinkles, like distant wind chimes. The sound was audible, yet utterly incongruous, a sensory transposition I had once dismissed as metaphorical when deciphering the tablet's more abstract passages. The ephemeral made audible at the point of dissolution. It was there, clear as the crystalline chime itself, a grammatical rule enacted. My legs, once leaden with fear, now moved with a purpose born of grim understanding. I approached an old stone well, its ancient mechanism usually groaning with effort. An elder, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, labored at the crank. But the rope, instead of winding smoothly, seemed to fold upon itself, shortening in segments, like a collapsing sequence of mirrored images, until the bucket emerged. The water in the bucket, however, was not still. It vibrated with a low, resonant hum, a sound that seemed to emanate from within the liquid itself, not from its surface. The elder dipped a ladle, drank, and offered no sign of alarm. To him, the hum was simply how water sounded now. This was the profound horror. Not just the impossible phenomena, but the serene, unblinking acceptance of it. Humanity, or this fragment of it within the foggy village, was not driven mad, it had been recoded. Their perception, their very understanding of normalcy, had been subtly, brutally rewritten. They were speaking the new grammar, living its rules, without ever knowing the previous syntax. I was an anomaly among anomalies, the last speaker of a dead tongue in a world learning a new, terrifying one. But its movement was not continuous, it paused at infinitesimal intervals, its journey a series of abrupt, almost imperceptible teleportations, each step a blink in space. It was the discrete recursion, the quantum-like jump of positional verbs I had found so maddeningly elusive. The world was not breaking, it was merely operating under a new, alien set of rules, rules I had painstakingly, ignorantly, unveiled. My determination hardened into something akin to a desperate resolve. I had opened this door, and now, I had to understand what lay beyond it, before the old grammar, and with it, my own mind, dissolved completely. My determination, a fragile reed in this storm of unmeaning, held me upright, propelled me forward into the deepening strangeness. The cobblestones, once firm and predictable, now felt fluid. Not physically yielding, but their cobblestone-ness seemed to waver, as if their definition was momentarily negotiable. A stray dog, a shaggy mongrel I recognized from countless previous walks, trotted past, its tail a question mark in the vapor. But as it turned a corner, its form elongated, then compressed, not in a distorting blur, but as if its very canine nature was being renegotiated by an unseen hand, a silent, cosmic scribe. It vanished, and I felt no surprise, only a quiet, academic interest in the mechanics of the alteration. This was the new syntax. I entered the village square, its ancient fountain usually a steady murmur of falling water. Today, the water did not fall. It ascended. Not in a powerful geyser, but in slow, deliberate droplets, each one detaching from the basin, hovering, then gently drifting upwards into the dense, gray air. A small child, no older than 5, stood by the fountain, reaching out a hand, not in wonder, but in casual interaction. He plucked a rising droplet from the air, and it solidified in his palm, a perfect, polished stone. He then tossed it back, and it dissolved into the mist, vanishing without a ripple. His mother, a woman with kind eyes and a worn apron, called to him, her voice a melody of familiar concern. "Don't play with the upward water, dear. You'll miss your meal." She saw nothing amiss. Her reality had already been rewritten, her lexicon adjusted. This wasn't just my perception. This was their reality, too. The entity's language wasn't merely a translation I performed, it was a living, breathing paradigm that had subsumed existence. My efforts, my brilliant, horrifying work, had not just awakened it, but had given it the final word on what was. The world was no longer merely described by its grammar, it was its grammar. I saw a baker emerge from his shop, flour dusting his apron, a loaf of bread clutched in his hands. The bread was wrong. It was geometrically impossible, a Mobius strip of crust and crumb, twisting in on itself without beginning or end. Yet, the baker held it with perfect normalcy, his brow furrowed in thought, perhaps contemplating the taste, perhaps the price. A merchant, setting up his stall, meticulously arranged an array of objects that shifted their identity with each glance. A wooden spoon became a tangle of silver wire, then a cluster of iridescent scales, then a wooden spoon again. He haggled with a passerby over the quality of the spoon scales, their conversation a bizarre tapestry of interchangeable nouns, yet perfectly coherent to them. That was it. The words still existed, the sounds still formed, but their referents were no longer anchored. They were fluid, subject to the whim of a deeper, unspoken grammar. My sanity, once a carefully constructed edifice, had not shattered, it had merely been rebricked, its very foundations altered. I was no longer Seth Raj, the linguist grappling with an ancient tongue. I was Seth, a component within that tongue, an observer granted the terrible gift of understanding the new rules while others simply played by them, unseeing. I watched a young man and a young woman, their hands intertwined, walk past me, their faces alight with a youthful hope. He spoke of the future, of a cottage by the sea, of children. And as he spoke, the very air around them shimmered, not with magic, but with a subtle, almost imperceptible rearrangement. A faint scent of salt touched the mist, a distant cry of a gull echoed, and the cobblestones beneath their feet momentarily softened, like sand. Their words, their desires, were not just expressions, they were commands asterisk, shaping the world around them, however fleetingly. They were unknowingly speaking the language, embodying its power, their innocent dreams manifesting in tiny, ephemeral shifts. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them, the village was still there, the mist still breathing. The upward water still rose, the Mobius bread still twisted. My reflection in a puddle, though distorted by the ripples, seemed to show not just my own face, but the faint, almost transparent lines of a script etched across my skin, a silent testament to the terrible knowledge I now contained. The entity had not merely woken, it had become the world. And I, Seth, was its first, most devoted, and most eternally lost reader. The language was complete.